James Fletcher arrived in Red Lodge, Montana Territory in June 1892 with a geology degree from the University of Pennsylvania, research equipment that nobody in town recognized, and plans to spend 2 years studying the Beartooth volcanic formations that geologists back east considered scientifically significant, but locals considered just rocks. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and completely unprepared for how much frontier communities distrusted educated men who studied things that had no practical value. Red Lodge was a mining town. People dug up ore that had worth. They didn't understand why someone would spend years studying rock formations that couldn't be sold. The university had arranged housing for James. A small cabin on the edge of town, previously occupied by a prospector who died the previous winter. The cabin was basic frontier construction. 16 by 20 feet, single-layer walls, a cast-iron stove that the landlord assured James was adequate for Montana winters. James moved in and spent his first month exploring the surrounding mountains, documenting volcanic rock formations, collecting samples, taking notes that would eventually become academic papers nobody in Red Lodge would ever read. He was happy. This was why he'd become a geologist. To understand how the Earth worked, how ancient forces had shaped the landscape. Then July brought a conversation that changed everything. He was at the general store buying supplies when he overheard 3 miners discussing the previous winter. How brutal it had been, how many people had nearly died from inadequate heating, how the prospector who'd lived in James's cabin had frozen to death because his stove couldn't maintain temperature during a 3-day blizzard. "Froze solid in his own bed," one miner said. "Stove was still burning when they found him, just couldn't heat the cabin enough when it hit -40. James felt cold despite the warm July day. He was living in a cabin where someone had frozen to death because the heating system was inadequate, and he had no reason to think the coming winter would be any milder. But James had knowledge the prospector hadn't possessed. He'd studied geothermal systems at the University of Pennsylvania under Professor Heinrich Werner, a German geologist who'd spent decades analyzing volcanic rock properties across Iceland and Italy, had written his university thesis on heat retention in volcanic formations, specifically examining how different igneous rock types absorbed, stored, and released thermal energy at varying rates. The thesis had earned him top marks and academic publication, but his professors had considered it purely theoretical. Interesting science with no practical applications, just documentation of how rocks behaved under thermal stress. Just numbers and charts and geological principles that mattered to other geologists but nobody else. And he'd noticed something during his first month of geological surveys around Red Lodge. The volcanic rock formations here weren't just geologically significant. They had exceptional thermal properties that made them perfect for exactly the kind of application nobody had considered. The Beartooth volcanic complex had created basalt deposits with high iron content, rhyolite formations with excellent crystalline structure, and volcanic tuff layers with exceptional density. Each rock type had specific thermal characteristics he documented in his academic work. Basalt with high iron content could absorb heat rapidly and hold it at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Rhyolite's crystalline structure conducted heat evenly, preventing hotspots and distributing thermal energy throughout its mass. Volcanic tuff formed from compressed volcanic ash had exceptional long-term retention, releasing stored heat slowly over 12 to 16 hours. These weren't just interesting geological facts. These were thermal engineering properties that could be applied practically. And James was probably the only person in Montana Territory who understood both the geology and the potential applications. He conceived an idea that made perfect scientific sense and would sound completely insane to everyone in Red Lodge. He'd build an underground thermal mass chimney system using local volcanic rock. Instead of routing smoke directly up and out, wasting 90% of the combustion heat, He'd route it through chambers filled with volcanic stone beneath his cabin. The rock would absorb heat from the smoke, store it like a geological battery, and radiate it upward through his floor for hours after each fire ended. He took the idea to William Henshaw, the town's senior builder, and the man everyone consulted for construction advice. Henshaw listened with the patient expression of someone humoring an educated fool. "Mr. Fletcher, you want to fill holes under your cabin with rocks and run your chimney through them? Volcanic rock with specific thermal mass properties. The smoke will transfer heat to the stone. The stone will retain that heat and radiate it upward. It's the same principle as geothermal systems, just applied to conventional combustion." "Son, I've built houses in Montana for 30 years. Heat goes up chimneys. That's how it works. You can't trap heat in rocks underground. Heat escapes. Always has. Always will. Heat escapes when you let it escape. But volcanic basalt can store thermal energy at efficiencies approaching 60% retention over 12-hour periods. I've documented this in geological surveys. The same properties that... I don't care about your surveys back east. This is Montana. We build chimneys up, not down. We heat with stoves, not buried rocks. If you want to survive winter, you do it the way everyone else does it, not with book learning and college theories." James tried 2 other builders. Both refused. Both said the same things in different words. College education doesn't mean practical knowledge. Books don't keep you warm. Build a conventional chimney or freeze like the last man who lived in that cabin. James decided to build it himself. He had no construction experience, but he had detailed geological knowledge of exactly which rocks to use and how to position them for maximum thermal retention. He had scientific principles that didn't care whether frontier builders believed in them. He started in August, working alone because nobody would help with a project they considered doomed, and nobody wanted to be associated with the college fool's failure. The work had to be methodical. This wasn't just digging holes. This was precision excavation, creating chambers with exact dimensions for optimal thermal mass performance. First, he needed to excavate beneath his cabin to create the thermal mass chambers. The cabin sat on short stone piers about 16 inches tall, creating roughly 2 feet of clearance between ground level and floor joists. Enough space to crawl under for repairs, but nowhere near enough space for the thermal system he envisioned. He needed at least 4 feet of depth to build chambers large enough to hold sufficient volcanic rock mass. He crawled under the cabin on the first Saturday of August with a shovel, a lantern, measuring tape, and the detailed diagrams he'd drawn based on his geological calculations. The work was immediately claustrophobic, low ceiling of rough floorboards above, hard-packed earth below, stone piers creating obstacles, spiderwebs, and the constant awareness that he was undermining the structure he lived in. But he worked systematically, not randomly. He was creating 3 separate chambers, each positioned precisely for optimal heat flow. The first chamber would be directly beneath where his stove sat, positioned to receive the hottest combustion gases. This chamber needed to be large, 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep below the current ground level. That was 96 cubic feet of earth to remove from a space where he could barely turn around. The excavation was agonizing. He'd dig for an hour, removing maybe 2 or 3 cubic feet of packed earth, filling buckets and dragging them backwards to the access opening, then crawl out filthy and exhausted, dump the dirt, rest his aching back, and crawl back in. Progress was measured in painful inches per day. Each chamber had to be precise, level bottom, for stable rock positioning, vertical walls to maximize volume, exact depth to ensure adequate thermal mass without undermining structural integrity. He shored up the cabin floor as he dug, installing additional support posts, reinforcing joists, maintaining safety while creating chambers that nobody believed would serve any useful purpose. The miners who passed by his cabin noticed the dirt piles growing, noticed James emerging covered in soil evening after evening, started making jokes about the college boy digging holes like he was looking for gold underground. The mockery became public at the monthly town meeting in September. William Henshaw raised concerns about James's construction project. The educated gentleman from Philadelphia is digging under his cabin, building some kind of rock pile underneath. Claims it's for heating. I'm concerned he's creating a structural hazard that could affect neighboring properties if his cabin collapses. James stood to respond. I'm building thermal mass chambers using volcanic rock with documented heat retention properties. The structural integrity is sound. I've shored up the floor with additional supports. There's no hazard to anyone. You're putting rocks in holes, Henshaw said. That's not heating. That's foolishness. And when you freeze this winter, we're going to have another dead body to dig out of that cabin. The room laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the dismissive laughter of practical men hearing impractical ideas from someone who'd never spent a winter in Montana. James kept building. By October, the 3 chambers were excavated and ready. Now came the crucial part: selecting and positioning the volcanic rock. He spent 2 weeks hiking to specific formations, collecting stones with the precise thermal properties he needed. Basalt with high iron content for maximum heat absorption. Rhyolite with good thermal conductivity for even heat distribution. Volcanic tuff with excellent long-term retention characteristics. He filled the chambers methodically. Hundreds of pounds of stone, each piece selected for specific properties, positioned to maximize contact area and heat transfer. The basalt chamber nearest the stove entry point, the rhyolite in the middle, the tuff at the far end before the exit chimney. Then he built the smoke routing system. Unlike conventional chimneys that went straight up, his would go down first. From his stove, smoke would descend through a sealed channel into the basalt chamber, flow through the volcanic rock, transfer heat, then continue to the rhyolite chamber, transfer more heat, then to the tuff chamber, transfer even more heat, then finally exit through a chimney positioned 20 feet from his cabin. Every foot of that journey, hot combustion gases would contact volcanic rock optimized for thermal absorption. By the time smoke reached the exit chimney, it would be cool. All that heat would be stored in the rock beneath his floor. The final connection was installed on October 20th. He disconnected his conventional chimney from the stove, created a new downward routing system that everyone said violated the laws of physics, sealed all the joints carefully so no smoke would escape into his living space. The test came on October 25th. First cold night of autumn. Temperature dropped to 30 degrees. James built a fire in his stove, lit it, and watched to see if smoke would draft downward through his system or back up into his cabin. The smoke pooled at the stove opening for a few seconds. Then, slowly, it began flowing downward into the entry channel. He heard it moving through the chambers beneath his floor, a soft rushing sound, as hot gas flowed through volcanic rock. 30 seconds later, smoke emerged from the distant chimney, steady and strong. The draft worked perfectly. His system was routing combustion gases through 300 pounds of volcanic thermal mass before exhausting to atmosphere. He let the fire burn for 3 hours, feeding it regularly, building heat. The stove functioned normally. No smoke leaked into the cabin. Everything exhausted cleanly through the underground system, exactly as his geological calculations had predicted. After 3 hours, he let the fire die completely. No coals remaining. Stove cold. In a conventional system, the cabin would cool rapidly. Heat would escape through the walls and roof. Within 2 hours, interior temperature would match exterior temperature. James monitored carefully with precise thermometers he'd brought from Philadelphia. Exterior temperature, 30 degrees. Cabin interior when fire ended, 68 degrees. 1 hour later, 65 degrees. 2 hours later, 63 degrees. 4 hours later, 61 degrees. The volcanic rock thermal batteries beneath his floor were releasing stored heat exactly as predicted. The cabin was maintaining comfortable temperature hours after the fire ended. Heat that conventional chimneys wasted to atmosphere was being captured, stored, and utilized. November brought serious testing. Temperature dropping to 0 degrees. James's neighbors were burning wood constantly, feeding stoves continuously, struggling to maintain 55 degrees inside. James burned wood twice daily for 3 hours each time. His volcanic thermal mass system maintained 60 to 65 degrees continuously between burns. The geological principles were proving correct in practical application. Basalt absorbed heat rapidly during combustion. Rhyolite distributed that heat evenly through its crystalline structure. Volcanic tuff released heat slowly over many hours. The three-stage cascade system was more efficient than James had even calculated. But the community noticed his minimal wood consumption and drew wrong conclusions. The college boy wasn't really staying warm. He was too proud to admit his system didn't work. He'd probably freeze when real winter arrived and would leave town embarrassed. December brought Montana winter in full force, not gradually building cold that gave people time to adjust, not with warnings that allowed final preparations. One day it was cold, the next day it was lethal. The day after that, it was testing every assumption about adequate preparation. December 15th started deceptively mild. 20 degrees at dawn, actually pleasant for mid-December. People went about normal activities. The miners worked their claims. Women hung laundry that might actually dry in the weak winter sunlight. Children played outside without desperate layers. It felt like maybe this winter wouldn't be as brutal as the last one. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 0 degrees, a 20-degree fall in 6 hours. That should have been the final warning, but most people assumed it was just typical mountain weather volatility, the kind of temperature swings that happened regularly at elevation. By evening, the thermometers read -20. By midnight, -30 degrees. The fall was so rapid that water froze in buckets placed indoors near stoves, that livestock caught in distant pastures began dying from exposure they hadn't anticipated. That inadequate preparation revealed itself immediately as survival threat, and it kept dropping. -35 by 2 a.m. December 16th, -40 by dawn. This wasn't normal Montana cold. This was Arctic air that had pushed south from Canada, that was settling into the valleys and refusing to lift, that was creating conditions more extreme than Red Lodge had experienced in a decade. The wind built as temperature dropped, creating effective temperatures that made exposed skin dangerous within seconds. 40-mile-per-hour sustained wind at -40 degrees created wind chill approaching -70. Breathing unprotected air burned lungs. Walking from house to barn meant risking frostbite on any exposed skin. Survival became the only priority for everyone caught unprepared. James's neighbors were in immediate crisis from the first night of extreme cold. Wood supplies that should have lasted until March were depleting at rates that meant running out by January. Houses that seemed adequately prepared for normal Montana winters couldn't maintain livable temperature despite maximum heating efforts. Families were making desperate decisions about survival that all involved suffering. The Hendricks family's house dropped to 48 degrees inside, despite burning wood continuously from the moment temperature started falling seriously. Mr. Hendricks was feeding 2 stoves simultaneously, consuming fuel faster than he'd imagined possible, watching interior temperature fall steadily despite maximum effort. Their 3 children were showing signs of sustained cold exposure, lethargy, confusion, dangerous drowsiness that indicated hypothermia was beginning. By day 3, the Hendricks were burning furniture. Kitchen chairs first, then a table, then bed frames from rooms they'd abandoned. burning anything wooden that would produce heat because the alternative was watching their children develop frostbite indoors, was accepting that inadequate heating would kill them. The Thompson cabin, smaller and supposedly easier to heat, couldn't maintain 40 degrees inside, despite the stove glowing red from continuous maximum burning. Mrs. Thompson was sick with pneumonia, needing warmth to recover, but the cabin couldn't provide adequate temperature, no matter how much wood they consumed. Mr. Thompson was facing terrible calculations about whether to risk the journey to town through -40 conditions to seek help, knowing the trip would likely kill him, but staying meant watching his wife deteriorate. Every family in Red Lodge was suffering variations of the same crisis. Inadequate heat despite desperate effort, fuel supplies disappearing, sustained cold weakening everyone, especially children and elderly. Decisions about which rooms to sacrifice, which furniture to burn, how to survive until the cold broke. The saloon became an emergency shelter. Owner Tom Bradley kept 3 stoves burning continuously, allowed families to crowd in at night, charged nothing for the warmth. By day 4, 20 people were sleeping on the saloon floor because their homes couldn't maintain survivable temperature overnight. James's cabin, heated by his volcanic rock thermal mass system that everyone had mocked, maintained 60 to 62 degrees throughout the week, with wood consumption that seemed physically impossible to everyone else. He burned wood 3 times daily instead of his normal twice, compensating for extreme cold. Each 3-hour burn charged his geological batteries beneath the floor. The 300 pounds of carefully selected volcanic rock, basalt for rapid absorption, rhyolite for even distribution, tuff for long-term retention, absorbed tremendous heat during each burn and released it steadily for 8 to 10 hours afterward. The system that William Henshaw had said violated basic physics was outperforming every conventional heating system in Red Lodge by dramatic margin. On day 4 of sustained -35 to -40 temperatures, William Henshaw came to James's cabin, not to check welfare, not from concern, from desperate need to understand how the college boy was surviving comfortably while everyone else was suffering catastrophically. James heard the knock, opened the door, and warm air rolled out into wind that was literally painful to breathe. Henshaw stood there, frost forming on his beard from his own breath, layered in every piece of winter clothing he owned, shaking from cold exposure despite the layers. "Can I come in?" Henshaw asked, voice hoarse. "Just for a moment, to warm up." James stepped aside. Henshaw entered and stood just inside the door, feeling warmth that seemed impossible. The cabin was genuinely warm, not the barely survivable 50 degrees his own house was maintaining, actually comfortable temperature. And James was standing there in normal indoor clothing without the desperate layers everyone else was wearing continuously. "Your cabin is warm, actually warm. It's -35 outside and you're warmer than my house with 2 stoves burning continuously. How is this possible?" "The volcanic rock thermal mass system you said violated physics. It doesn't violate physics. It applies physics. Geothermal principles using combustion heat instead of Earth's internal heat." "Ahu." Henshaw walked around the cabin, feeling warm floor beneath his boots, seeing no active fire burning, trying to reconcile practical experience with theoretical impossibility. "The rocks under your floor, they're holding heat?" "Absorbing it during combustion and releasing it over 12 to 16 hours. Basalt for rapid absorption, rhyolite for distribution, volcanic tuff for long-term retention. 3-stage thermal cascade optimized for the specific igneous formations available in this region. Can you show me how to build this? My family is suffering. Everyone's suffering. If this works, and clearly it works, people need to know." The cold snap lasted until December 22nd, 7 days of -30 to -40 temperatures. When it finally broke, James's cabin had used maybe 2 cords of wood total. His neighbors had burned through entire winter supplies in 1 week. The community's attitude changed immediately. The college boy they'd mocked understood something they'd missed completely. The educated Easterner with his book learning had outsurvived every practical frontiersman in Red Lodge. People came to understand the system. James showed them the chambers beneath his cabin, explained thermal mass theory in simple terms, described which volcanic rocks to use and why, helped them understand that heat retention was geology, not magic. By January, 5 families had asked James to help design similar systems. By February, 3 were under construction. The buried thermal mass chimney concept, mocked for months, became the most desired heating innovation in Red Lodge. James became an unlikely consultant. The geologist studying volcanic formations for academic papers was now teaching miners how to select and position stone for maximum thermal efficiency. He made more money from consulting fees that winter than the university paid him for 2 years of research. And the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to Montana to study rocks because they were geologically significant. He'd ended up using those same rocks to solve practical problems because the properties that made them scientifically interesting made them thermally useful. William Henshaw came to apologize in March when spring was breaking winter's grip. "I was wrong about everything. Wrong about your system. Wrong about book learning. Wrong about assuming practical experience is always superior to scientific knowledge." "You weren't entirely wrong," James said. "Practical experience is valuable, but so is scientific understanding. The best solutions come from combining both. You know how to build structures that survive Montana weather. I know how volcanic rock behaves thermally. Together, those knowledge sets create something neither of us could create alone." James stayed in Red Lodge for 5 more years, completed his geological research, published papers on Beartooth volcanic formations that other geologists read with interest. But his most cited work wasn't about ancient volcanic activity. It was about thermal properties of igneous rock and applications to residential heating in extreme climates. He eventually married a schoolteacher named Catherine, who appreciated both his scientific mind and his willingness to apply knowledge practically. They built a larger house using underground thermal mass principles, incorporating innovations James developed through experimentation. Raised 2 children in the warmest house in Montana Territory. The original cabin still exists, maintained by the Montana Geological Society as a demonstration of applied geothermal principles. Modern thermal analysis confirms what James proved in 1892. Volcanic rock thermal mass storage using waste heat from combustion is remarkably efficient. The specific rocks he selected are still considered optimal for thermal applications. The historical marker reads, James Fletcher, 1863 to 1938, geologist who applied volcanic rock thermal properties to residential heating in 1892, designed underground thermal mass chimney system that influenced heating technology across Montana Territory, proved that scientific knowledge and practical application are complementary, not contradictory. But the real story is simpler and more profound. A 29-year-old scientist, told by every practical expert that his idea violated common sense, built it anyway because geological principles don't care whether builders believe in them. He proved that heat can be stored in rock if you select the right rock and position it correctly. That combustion waste heat is a resource, not just exhaust. That volcanic formations studied for academic interest have practical applications nobody had considered. And sometimes the educated man from Philadelphia knows something the Montana frontiersman doesn't. Not because education is superior to experience, but because different knowledge creates different solutions. James died in 1938 at age 75. His funeral was attended by 200 people, including geologists from 3 universities and miners who'd built heating systems based on his designs. The minister who spoke wasn't from Red Lodge. He was from Philadelphia, James's oldest friend from university who'd traveled west to say goodbye. James came to Montana to study rocks, the minister said. He stayed because he learned that understanding rocks meant understanding how to help people. His greatest achievement wasn't his published papers. It was keeping families warm through winters that killed the unprepared. That's the difference between knowledge for its own sake and knowledge applied with purpose. James embodied both. The cabin still stands. The volcanic rock chambers still exist beneath it. And every winter, when temperatures drop to -30 in Montana, people tell the story of the geologist who buried his chimney underground and proved that sometimes the strangest solution is the most scientific solution. The rocks are still there, still holding heat the way they did in 1892, still proving that basalt, rhyolite and volcanic tuff don't care whether people understand thermal mass theory. They just work the way geology says they'll work. And that's the greatest vindication any scientist can achieve. Not being proven right in theory, being proven right in practice by people who didn't believe the theory but can't argue with the results.